I had spent the morning carefully choosing the cake, imagining the smile on my son's face when I arrived. The aroma of chocolate and vanilla filled the kitchen, a small comfort as I straightened the ribbon and placed a handwritten card on top. I felt a flutter of nervous excitement, hoping this birthday would be different. Maybe a sign that the distance between us could shrink, even for just a day. There was a quiet tension I couldn't shake, a tiny voice whispering that something might go wrong, but I pushed it aside. Before we continue, I have to ask. Have you ever prepared your heart for a moment of love, only to be met with complete rejection, and wondered if your presence even mattered to those you cherished most? I grabbed my coat and keys, rehearsing the cheerful words I would say, imagining laughter, candles, and fleeting warmth. The anticipation was nearly unbearable, a mix of hope and dread that clung to me with every step I took toward the door. Then it happened. My phone buzzed with a message from my son. "You're not invited." That one line pierced through everything I had been feeling, collapsing the morning's hopeful energy into a hollow ache. The anticipation, the care, the memories I'd imagined, they all vanished in an instant. The betrayal was sharp, intimate, and inexplicable as I paused, standing in the quiet hallway, the cake in my hands heavier than ever, and realized that this birthday wouldn't be like the others. Something had shifted, and I had to decide how I would respond. After reading my son's message, I stood in the hallway with the cake pressed against my chest, the ribbon slightly crooked from nerves. The words, "You're not invited," kept replaying in my mind, echoing louder than the morning's quiet anticipation. I could still smell the chocolate and vanilla from the cake, the little card I had written folded neatly on top, each word meant to carry a piece of my heart. And yet, it felt as though the act of sending love had been met with a brick wall of indifference. My hands shook slightly as I tried to steady my breath. Realizing that the warmth I had imagined would never come, I set the cake down on the kitchen counter and sank into a chair, letting my thoughts wander. Birthdays had always been complicated with him. Even when he was a child, there had been moments when I felt more like a facilitator of happiness than a participant. I remembered the years of wrapping presents at midnight, the early mornings preparing pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, the long drives to pick up friends for birthday parties. Back then, it had felt natural, necessary even, to give without expecting. And now, decades later, the gesture I had planned, carefully and thoughtfully, was rejected outright. The disbelief lingered, crawling through every memory I had of him. I thought of his first steps, his crooked grin at age 7, the scraped knees and whispered secrets in the dark. For all those moments, I had been there, quietly present. I had thought those years had built a bridge, a quiet connection that could withstand distance or disagreement. Yet here I was, standing in my own kitchen, feeling more like a stranger than a parent. It was strange how time and familiarity could fail to protect you from sudden, sharp exclusion. That I tried to imagine what had led to this. Was it anger? Was it something I had said or done recently? Perhaps I had misread signs, thinking closeness existed where there was only polite civility. The truth was I didn't know, and not knowing was worse than knowing, because it left me with a rolling, unresolved ache that I could neither name nor push away. I picked up the cake again, feeling the weight of my own emotions more than the actual dessert. It seemed absurd to hold onto the physical object when the true sting came from the absence it represented. As I held the cake, I began to remember the last few birthdays. There was the year he had forgotten to call entirely, the year he had promised a dinner and canceled at the last moment. Each small disappointment had piled quietly, like dust settling in corners unseen until the moment it suffocates. Now, this outright rejection was like a gust of wind scattering the accumulation of years, leaving the stark reality in plain view. My heart throbbed with a mixture of sorrow and, oddly, a faint determination. Perhaps it was not just grief I felt, but a spark of agency that had been dormant for too long. I wandered through the kitchen, touching the counter, glancing at the small family photos on the wall. They were pictures of moments I had cherished, holidays, summer trips, even the mundane snapshots of us laughing over spilled cereal or tangled Christmas lights. Those images reminded me of the bond one had tried to nurture, and yet, here it was, fragile and easily overlooked. I could feel a quiet anger rising, Not the loud, combustible kind, but a steadier, simmering sort that demanded attention and, more importantly, action. Sitting back down, I stared at the message again. There was clarity in its bluntness, I realized. There were no excuses, no hidden meanings, no room for negotiation. The rejection was absolute, but in that absoluteness, I found a strange kind of freedom. For too long, I had allowed my happiness to hinge on his approval, his recognition, his invitations. And now, stripped of expectation, I could choose a path that honored my feelings without relying on his permission. I thought about what I could do with the cake. The idea had come suddenly, quietly, almost like a whisper in the back of my mind. Why not let it go somewhere meaningful but neutral, somewhere that would register the gesture without direct confrontation? The lawyer's office seemed perfect, not because it would humiliate him, but because it was a place connected to responsibility, authority, and the consequences of choices. It allowed me to acknowledge the rejection, reflect it back without anger, and reclaim a small measure of control in a situation that had felt entirely powerless. In that moment, I understood something important. It wasn't about punishing him. It wasn't about revenge. It was about asserting my presence in a world that had suddenly denied it. By sending the cake to the lawyer's office, I could both honor the day and assert that my feelings mattered, even if he refused to recognize them. It was subtle, private, and strangely satisfying. A declaration that my love, care, and dignity were not contingent on his invitation. I prepared the cake carefully, adjusting the ribbon once more, smoothing the edges of the card. Every detail mattered, not to impress him, but to honor the ritual of giving itself. And as I left the house, carrying the cake with measured steps, I felt the first flicker of calm in hours, a quiet recognition that, for the first time in a long while, I was acting entirely on my own terms. The morning's shock and hurt were still present, but alongside them now existed a clear, reflective purpose. The walk to the car was slow, almost meditative. I passed familiar streets, the sunlight catching on windows and sidewalks, and thought about how the world moves on relentlessly, indifferent to personal pain. And yet, within that indifference, I realized there is also the possibility of choice. How we respond, how we assert ourselves, and how we care for our own emotions, that is where true agency lies. The cake in my hands had become more than a birthday gesture. It was a symbol of quiet resilience, a way to navigate betrayal without losing self-respect. By the time I reached the lawyer's office, I was calm, collected, and aware that this small act would not erase the years of distance or misunderstanding, but it would mark a point, a line drawn with grace rather than anger. I stepped into the lobby, the familiar smell of leather and paper greeting me, and handed over the cake with a simple explanation. It was meant for him, on his birthday, with all the care I could still give. I left before any comment could be made, allowing the gesture to speak for itself. Driving home, I thought about what I had learned in just a few hours, the sharpness of rejection, the quiet power of subtle action, and the realization that dignity does not need validation. I thought about all the other moments I had spent bending toward someone else's expectations, and how liberating it felt to finally act for myself, to honor my own feelings first. It was not a dramatic victory, and it would not make headlines. But in that quiet, unassuming way, it was exactly the kind of triumph I needed. And as I pulled into the driveway, I knew that the story of this birthday, though tinged with sadness, would remain a marker of something more enduring. A reminder that exclusion cannot define my worth, and that sometimes, the smallest acts carry the deepest meaning. On the drive home, I thought the silence in the car would give me peace, but instead it became a mirror, forcing me to confront questions I had avoided. For years, I wondered when the turning point had happened, when the bond between us had shifted from closeness to indifference. Was it subtle, stretched out over countless moments of miscommunication? Or had there been one clear rupture that I simply refused to see? The truth was uncomfortable. Maybe the change hadn't been sudden at all, but gradual, like water carving stone. The memory of his teenage years came back to me, uninvited. I remembered the slammed doors, the sarcastic remarks, the way he had begun choosing friends over family dinners. I had told myself it was normal, a phase every child goes through. But even then, I had sensed a widening gap, though I never admitted it aloud. I thought if I stayed steady, providing meals, helping with homework, keeping the house warm, he would circle back in time. Looking at him now, grown, successful, with a family of his own, I realized he had never really circled back. The distance had simply matured with him. Did he a red light? I glanced at the empty passenger seat. For years, that seat had been filled with backpacks, sports gear, and later silence when he was too wrapped up in his own world to talk. I couldn't help but think of the dozens of car rides we'd shared, moments that, to me, had been precious but to him might have felt like background noise. It struck me how memory isn't shared equally. The moments that define one person's life may not even register for another. That thought stung more than I expected. When I reached home, I placed my keys on the counter and sat down without turning on the lights. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavier than sound. I replayed the moment of leaving the cake at the lawyer's office. A part of me worried I had crossed a line, that it might be seen as petty or strange. But a larger part of me held onto the conviction that it was necessary. It wasn't a grand act, but it was a statement, a quiet declaration that I would no longer be invisible. As the evening set in, I thought about what came next. Was this the end of the relationship, or simply another chapter in a long, uneven story? I knew I couldn't control his reaction. He might ignore the gesture entirely. He might mock it. Or maybe, though unlikely, he might stop for a moment and reflect. But in the end, his reaction mattered less than my choice to act with dignity. That realization settled me in a way nothing else had all day. Still, doubts crept in. Had I been too hard on him over the years without realizing it? Parents often think they're giving their children the best, but maybe he saw my sacrifices as control, my guidance as interference. The thought unsettled me. I didn't want to rewrite history to make myself the villain, but I couldn't deny that relationships are built from two sides. And if he saw me differently than I saw myself, perhaps that explained the distance more than I wanted to admit. I decided to call an old friend that night. She had known me for decades, had seen me through the ups and downs of raising him. I told her what had happened, from the rejection to the delivery at the lawyer's office. She listened quietly, then said something that stayed with me. Sometimes the gesture isn't about them. Sometimes it's about you reclaiming yourself. Her words gave me clarity. For too long, I had measured my worth by how much he accepted me. This time, I had chosen a path that reflected my own values, not his. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. My routine felt different, almost lighter, though the pain hadn't disappeared. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the neighborhood stir to life. Children hurried toward school buses, neighbors waved at each other, and life went on as if nothing had changed. And yet, for me, something had shifted internally. The rejection still hurt, but it no longer defined the day. Instead, the act of responding with quiet resolve had created space for me to breathe again. That I didn't hear from him that day, or the day after. A small part of me had hoped for a call, even a brief acknowledgement, but none came. And perhaps that silence was its own message. He had moved on, and I needed to accept that. Still, I refused to let the silence hollow me out. Instead, I began to focus on small acts of care for myself. Reading, cooking meals I enjoyed, calling people who valued my presence. Each action reminded me that connection exists in many forms, and that one person's rejection doesn't erase a lifetime of bonds elsewhere. Later that week, while organizing some old boxes, I found a folder of birthday cards he had made me as a child. The handwriting was clumsy, the drawings uneven, but each one carried a sincerity that made my chest ache. To the best mom ever. One read, complete with stick figures holding hands. Holding those cards, I felt both grief and comfort. The love had been real once, even if it had changed over time. And maybe that was enough, to honor what had been, without clinging desperately to what no longer was. In the quiet of that evening, I came to a realization. Families are complicated, layered with memories, disappointments, hopes, and misunderstandings. Sometimes the love we give isn't returned in the way we expect, but that doesn't diminish its value. What mattered most wasn't whether he celebrated his birthday with me, but whether I continued to live with integrity, refusing to let rejection reduce me to bitterness. I knew there would be more difficult moments ahead. Holidays, family gatherings, times when absence would be louder than presence. But now I felt better prepared to face them. Not because I had fixed the relationship, but because I had shifted the weight of responsibility. I no longer needed him to validate me. I only needed to stand firmly in my own sense of worth, even when overlooked. That night, as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I allowed myself one final thought. Sometimes the truest resilience isn't in repairing broken bonds, but in learning to carry yourself with quiet strength despite them. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, but it's steady. And in its steadiness, I found something I had long forgotten. Peace that didn't depend on anyone else. The days that followed carried a strange rhythm. On one hand, my routine felt unchanged. Coffee in the morning, a walk around the block, small chores that kept me occupied. Yet beneath the surface, a current of unease pulled at me. The silence from my son was louder than words could have been. It pressed against me during the quietest hours, demanding I confront the truth I'd been skirting around, and I found myself lingering at the mailbox more than once, half expecting an envelope with his handwriting or even a message typed by his wife. Nothing came. Rationally, I told myself I wasn't waiting, but deep down I knew I was. That longing unsettled me, because it reminded me how easily my worth could still feel tethered to his recognition. One afternoon, while sorting through some old papers, I stumbled upon the contact card of the lawyer where I had left the cake. My hands hovered over it for a long time. Part of me wanted to call to ask if the cake had even been picked up. Had he seen it, or had it been tossed aside without a second thought? The thought of my gesture being wasted, discarded like a meaningless object, gnawed at me. And yet I stopped myself. I realized the answer might hurt more than the uncertainty. Instead, I opened a journal I hadn't written in for years. The pages smelled faintly of dust. The ink of old entries faded. I began to write about the birthday, about the rejection, the delivery, the silence that followed. Once the words started flowing, I couldn't stop. I poured memories onto the page. The first birthday cake I ever baked for him. The year he begged for a baseball glove. The time he invited all his friends over without warning and I stayed up past midnight cleaning. Each memory landed heavy, but writing them gave me a strange clarity. It was as if I was piecing together a map of where we had been, even if it didn't explain where we stood now. Later that week, a neighbor stopped by. She noticed me sitting on the porch, journal in hand. After some small talk, she gently asked if something was bothering me. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to open that door. But something about her tone, curious but not prying, made me admit the truth. I told her what had happened, the rejection, and the cake. She didn't look shocked. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if she had heard versions of this story before. "It's hard," she said, "when the people you love the most are the ones who push you away." Her words stayed with me. It was the first time I had said the story aloud to someone outside my small circle. And in that moment, I realized how many people quietly carried similar wounds. Estranged children, fractured families, silent feuds. My pain wasn't unique, even if it felt deeply personal. That realization didn't erase the hurt, but it eased the loneliness. That night, I lay awake replaying her words. When the people you love the most are the ones who push you away. It made me wonder, had I done the same to someone else at some point in my life? Had there been a friend, a sibling, someone I had unintentionally pushed aside while chasing my own goals? The thought unsettled me, but it also made me more compassionate, toward myself and maybe even toward my son. Still, compassion didn't erase the boundaries. I knew I couldn't let him treat me like an afterthought forever. The act with the cake had been my first step in reclaiming some dignity. The journal became my second. Each entry reminded me that my voice still mattered, even if he didn't want to hear it. Toward the end of that week, I received an invitation from a cousin for a family gathering. For a moment, I considered declining, too weighed down by my own family's absence to face the presence of others. But then I thought of how isolation had already begun to shrink my world. If I pulled back further, I risked losing more than just my son. I risked losing myself. So I went to the gathering, I watched cousins laugh with their children, parents fuss over plates of food, small arguments erupting and dissolving within minutes. It struck me how messy, imperfect, and yet alive those connections were. They reminded me of the years when my own family life had been just as loud and chaotic. For the first time in a while, I didn't feel envy watching them. Instead, I felt gratitude for the reminder that love, even strained or flawed, was still worth showing up for. Driving home, I realized something important. Maybe reconciliation with my son wasn't around the corner. Maybe it never would come. But life wasn't waiting on that one relationship. There were still other bonds I could nurture, other places I could pour my care and energy. My worth didn't vanish because one person withheld affection. That night, I placed the journal on my bedside table and wrote one final line before closing it. I will not let rejection be the only story I tell myself. It wasn't a grand vow, just a quiet promise to hold myself steady. And for the first time in weeks, I slept without replaying the birthday in my head. Even though I had promised myself not to dwell on the birthday, the silence that followed carried a weight of its own. The cake, the message, the journal entries, they had opened a door inside me I couldn't close again. Something kept pressing against me, urging me to face questions I had left untouched for years. I thought I was ready to move forward, but life has a way of tugging at loose threads you don't expect. One morning, as I sorted through the stack of mail left on my kitchen counter, I noticed an envelope that stood out. It was plain, with no return address, but the handwriting on the front pulled me in immediately. It wasn't my son's, yet it was oddly familiar. My chest tightened as I set the rest of the pile aside. For a moment, I just held it there, the thin paper trembling in my hand. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what was inside, but I couldn't ignore it either. When I finally opened it, I found a short note from his wife. It was polite, almost too careful in its wording. She wrote that they were moving in a different direction and needed space. The words were vague but deliberate, leaving no room for misunderstanding. What struck me most was the absence of my son's own voice. He hadn't written it. He hadn't signed it. He hadn't even touched the page. That silence was louder than anything the letter said. That I read it again and again, each time trying to find some hidden softness, some signal that this wasn't as final as it seemed. But the more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't a temporary cooling off. It was a boundary, drawn firmly and without apology. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the birthdays, all the sacrifices, all the quiet hopes I had carried as a parent. To be dismissed in a few lines, by someone outside the bond we once had, stung in a way I couldn't fully describe. I wasn't just left out of a celebration. I was being written out of the story of his life. I sat with that pain for days, sometimes in silence, sometimes scribbling furiously in my journal. Writing became my only outlet, a way to keep myself from drowning in what-ifs and maybes. Yet beneath the anger and sorrow, another thought began to form. A suspicion that the letter wasn't only about me. It sounded like someone else was shaping the distance, maybe even protecting him from something he couldn't say himself. The idea unsettled me, but it also gave me a strange sort of clarity. For the first time, I wondered if my son's silence wasn't entirely his choice. That possibility didn't excuse him, but it shifted the way I thought about the situation. Maybe he was weaker than I had ever realized. Maybe he was allowing someone else to steer his decisions. I carried that thought with me when I visited the lawyer again, under the pretense of asking about some routine paperwork. As we wrapped up, I hesitated before leaving and asked casually whether my son had ever picked up the cake. The lawyer gave me a sympathetic look, then admitted it had been collected, but not by my son, by his wife. My heart sank. She had taken the cake, not him. I didn't need to ask what happened to it afterward. Driving home, I felt torn between fury and relief. Fury that such a simple gesture had been intercepted, stripped of its meaning. Relief that my instincts had been right all along. This wasn't just about my son avoiding me. Someone else had stepped in, creating a barrier that I couldn't break through. But knowing the truth didn't soothe me. It only deepened the ache. Because what could I do? Confronting her would only push him further away. Pleading with him might only harden his silence. I felt trapped, watching a relationship I once cherished being pulled out from under me, and all I could do was decide how much of myself I was willing to lose in the process. One evening, as I sat staring at the unopened journal on my table, I realized I had a choice. I could keep writing entries meant for him, letters he might never read, stories he might never care to hear, or I could start writing for myself. For my own survival, my own dignity. That small shift in perspective steadied me. I didn't stop grieving, but I started to see that my life could not remain frozen at the doorway of his rejection. The letter from his wife hadn't been the closure I wanted, but it was clarity I couldn't ignore. It forced me to admit that waiting around for scraps of acknowledgement would only drain me further. And so, for the first time in a long while, I began to imagine what life might look like if I stopped waiting entirely. After weeks of circling the same thoughts, I decided silence could no longer be my only response. The letter his wife sent had closed one door, but it left too many questions unanswered. I knew I couldn't keep pretending that I was content to be pushed out of my own son's life without at least trying to hear the truth directly from him. It wasn't about pleading anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity by confronting what had been left unsaid. That I rehearsed the call in my head dozens of times before I finally picked up the phone. My hands shook as I dialed, not from fear but from the weight of everything this moment carried. Would he answer? Would he hang up? I braced myself for either possibility. The ring seemed endless, and just as I prepared to set the phone down, I heard his voice. "Hello." The sound was clipped, almost as if he was speaking to a stranger. My throat tightened, but I pushed the words out. "It's me. I won't take much of your time." There was a pause, then a sigh, the kind that told me he was already building his defenses. Still, he didn't hang up, and that alone felt like a small opening. "I received the letter," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But I need to know, was that your decision, or was it hers?" Silence again. I could hear faint movement in the background, maybe him pacing or shifting uncomfortably. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured, almost rehearsed. "We both agreed. It's for the best." Those words stung, but they also confirmed what I had suspected. He hadn't written the letter, but he was willing to stand behind it. Still, there was something in the way he said "we" that didn't sound like conviction. It sounded like compliance. "I'm not asking for much," I said quietly. "Just honesty. If you feel you can't have me in your life, say it yourself. Don't hide behind her words." For the first time, his voice cracked. "It's complicated." That was all he gave me before retreating into silence again. I waited, hoping he might elaborate, but the line stayed heavy with things unsaid. Eventually, he muttered, "I have to go." And the call ended. That I stared at the phone long after the screen went dark, feeling a mix of emptiness and strange relief. I hadn't gotten the clarity I wanted, but I had pierced through the surface long enough to hear his hesitation. It confirmed what I feared, that my son wasn't lost entirely, but he was caught in something he wasn't ready to confront. That night, I sat with my journal open, writing not to him this time, but to myself. I wrote about how years of effort, sacrifice, and quiet pride could dissolve into a single phone call that felt more like a negotiation than a reunion. Yet I also wrote about the faint crack I had heard in his voice, the small reminder that somewhere beneath the distance, my son was still there. The next day, I chose to put the journal away for a while. I needed to step back, not because I had given up, but because I could no longer allow his silence, or hers, to dictate the rhythm of my days. I began taking long walks in the morning, something I hadn't done in years. With each step, I tried to release the anger I carried, the bitterness that threatened to consume me. But healing isn't neat. Some mornings I woke with a sense of calm, ready to accept the distance. Other days, the ache would return full force, leaving me pacing the kitchen, replaying his words. "It's complicated." Those two words haunted me, like a door half open but never crossed. I realized I couldn't control what he chose to share or withhold. What I could control was how much of myself I allowed to be swallowed by waiting. So I started small. I joined a local book group. I visited the community center, where I ended up teaching a few people how to keep simple journals of their own. To my surprise, it felt good to give away the practice that had kept me afloat. Still, even as I built these new routines, part of me remained tethered to him. I wasn't chasing reconciliation anymore, but I couldn't erase the bond of years, the memories that formed the fabric of who I was as a parent. That bond wasn't something a letter or even silence could erase. Months later, I received another envelope. This one wasn't from his wife. It was from him. The handwriting was undeniably his. My hands trembled as I held it, remembering the last time I had recognized his hand on paper. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on the table for hours, unsure if I was ready to face what it contained. When I finally unfolded the letter, I found no apology, no sweeping gesture of reconciliation. Instead, it was a few short lines. I know things are difficult right now. I don't have answers, but I don't want you to think I've forgotten you. I can't promise more than that. It wasn't enough to heal the wound, but it was enough to keep it from festering completely. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe without the weight of absolute finality. I didn't reply right away. I folded the letter and placed it in my journal, alongside the pages I had once written for him. Maybe one day I would answer. Maybe one day he would be ready to speak freely, without fear or influence. Until then, I decided to carry on with my life, not as a parent waiting at the edge of rejection, but as a person learning to rebuild in the shadow of it. The disruption of that birthday, the unanswered questions, the silence, the intercepted cake, all of it had led me here, not to resolution, but to resilience. And though the wound remained, I had finally found a way to live without letting it define me. In the months that followed his brief letter, I began to see life less as something waiting to be mended and more as something that could be reshaped. The words he had sent, few as they were, told me that the door wasn't completely locked. But it also told me that I couldn't keep standing in the hallway, hoping it would swing wide open. I had to move forward with whatever strength I had left. The first step was learning to live without expectation. For years, every holiday, every birthday, every family occasion had carried the question of whether he would reach out, whether some gesture would bridge the distance. Now, I began to look at those days differently. Instead of measuring them by what I lacked, I filled them with small acts of meaning. I cooked the meals I loved, I wrote letters I never sent, and I spent time with people who reminded me that family could sometimes be chosen, not just inherited. Yet even in these efforts, the ache would rise uninvited. There were nights when the silence pressed so hard against me that I felt as though I might break under its weight. In those moments, I would take out his letter, not to read it again, but to remind myself that connection, however thin, still existed. That was enough to steady me, at least for a while. One evening at the community center, during a journaling workshop I had agreed to lead, someone asked me why I kept writing even when it felt like no one would ever read the pages. I surprised myself with my answer. Because sometimes writing isn't about being heard. It's about hearing yourself. The room fell quiet after that, and I realized the words weren't just for them. They were for me. I started to let my journal hold not only the pain, but also the small joys I discovered along the way. I wrote about the neighbor who brought me soup when I was sick, the laughter I heard from children playing outside, the sunrise that painted the sky in colors I hadn't stopped to notice in years. These weren't replacements for what I had lost, but they were reminders that life wasn't only defined by the wound my son had left. Still, I couldn't deny the deeper truth. Part of me would always long for him. That longing didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became less about waiting for reconciliation and more about carrying his memory with me in a way that didn't destroy me. I realized that love, even when rejected, doesn't vanish. It settles into the corners of your life, quiet but persistent, teaching you resilience you never thought you'd need. One morning, nearly a year after the forgotten birthday, I woke with a different sense of peace. I didn't expect a call, a visit, or another letter. Instead, I felt gratitude for having survived what once seemed unbearable. I had learned to keep moving, not because the pain had faded completely, but because I had chosen not to let it control me. Later that day, I passed by a bakery I hadn't visited in years. The sight of the cakes in the window brought back the memory of that intercepted birthday gift, the one that had sparked this entire storm. For a moment, bitterness stirred again. But instead of turning away, I walked inside and bought a small slice for myself. Sitting alone at the corner table, I ate it slowly, letting the sweetness settle where the bitterness once lived. It was my quiet act of reclaiming what had been taken from me. Not just the cake, but the dignity of my own choices. That evening, I wrote in my journal, "Some doors never open again, but that doesn't mean life ends in the hallway. Sometimes you build a new room for yourself, one where the light still gets in. I don't know if my son will ever step through that door again. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But I've stopped waiting at the threshold. I've chosen to live in the space I've created, one built on resilience, self-respect, and a deeper understanding of what it means to endure. And if he ever does return, he will find me not as the father who begged for a place in his life, but as a man who learned to carry on when silence was the only answer. That is the gift I give myself, the strength to stand, even when standing alone." The truth is, resilience doesn't erase the weight of old wounds. It only teaches you how to carry them differently. Even after I learned to reclaim parts of my life, I could never fully silence the question that had haunted me since that birthday. Why wasn't I enough for him? That question stayed with me during long walks, when I passed fathers and sons sharing simple moments. A game of catch, a shared coffee, even an argument softened by laughter at the end. I found myself watching them the way one stares at a window from the street, able to see in but never invited to step inside. The lawyer had once told me, almost offhand, that family disputes often begin with small fractures. Disagreements left unresolved, expectations unspoken, love taken for granted until resentment takes root. I kept turning that idea over in my mind, wondering where the first fracture between us had really begun. Was it in the choices I made when he was young? Was it in the silences we both allowed to stretch too far? Or was it in the way pride had sometimes gotten in the way of apology? Those thoughts became heavier when I noticed how others spoke of reconciliation. People at the community center would often say, "There's still time," as if time itself were a salve that healed all things. But I knew better. Time doesn't mend what isn't tended. It simply hardens the distance until even reaching out feels like breaking stone. One evening, I sat down with an old box of photographs. Most were from when he was a child. Holidays where his smile lit up the room. Birthdays where the cake was cut unevenly because he insisted on doing it himself. Afternoons when we walked through the park with ice cream dripping onto our hands. As I sifted through them, I felt something stir. Not hope exactly, but recognition. For all that had gone wrong, there had been a time when we belonged to each other without question. It was then I made a decision. I would write him, not another letter begging for entry into his life, but something different. A record, a story, the truth of who I was, and who I had tried to be, laid bare without expectation. I told myself it wasn't about winning him back. It was about leaving behind something honest, so that if he ever chose to look, he would see me clearly. The writing began hesitantly with sentences that felt fragile. But once I started, the words flowed. I wrote about my own father, a man both stern and distant, whose approval I chased for years and never quite caught. I wrote about the mistakes I made when I was young, about the times I raised my voice when patience would have been better, about the nights I worked late thinking it was for my family, while not realizing what I was missing at home. And I wrote about love, the small ways it had shown itself, packing his lunch before school, teaching him how to ride a bike, staying up through the night when he had a fever. I wrote about the pride I felt at his achievements, even the ones I never said out loud. The process wasn't easy. Each page asked me to face a version of myself I would rather forget. But it also reminded me that I was more than the rejection I carried. I was a man who had tried, failed, and tried again. A man who loved, even if that love was now unwanted. Weeks turned into months, and the story grew longer than I expected. By the time I finished, it wasn't a letter anymore, it was a manuscript. I bound the pages with string and tucked them into a box. I didn't know if I would ever send it to him. For now, it was enough that it existed, that my truth lived somewhere outside my own chest. Around that time, the lawyer reached out again. Not with legal news, but with a simple question. "Have you found peace?" I didn't know how to answer. Peace felt too complete a word, too final. What I had wasn't peace. It was endurance. A way of living beside the ache without letting it consume me. Still, I realized something important. My story wasn't just about being cast out of my son's life. It was also about what I did after that door closed. Whether he ever chose to open it again or not, I wanted my days to mean more than waiting in the dark. So I began to share pieces of my writing at the community center. Not the parts about my son directly, but the reflections on fathers, mistakes, and the complicated nature of love. To my surprise, people listened. Some even wept. And slowly, I understood. My pain wasn't mine alone. Others carried similar stories, similar fractures, similar longings that I in their eyes. I found something my son could not give me: recognition. And while it didn't erase the loss, it reminded me that life still had room for connection, even if it came from unexpected places. As I walked home one night, the manuscript tucked under my arm, I thought about the cake that had once sat heavy in my hands, unwanted and discarded at a lawyer's office. That moment had felt like the end. But now, I could see it was only the beginning of another story. One where survival didn't mean forgetting, but learning to live with the truth and keep moving anyway. That I once thought the manuscript would remain tucked away forever. A quiet record of my failings and hopes, hidden from the one person it was meant for. But life has a way of shifting without warning, turning private choices into unexpected reckonings. The box I had sealed with string didn't stay closed as long as I imagined. It began with a call from the lawyer. His tone carried an unusual weight, neither formal nor detached, but edged with hesitation. He told me my son had come by his office for unrelated paperwork and, while waiting, noticed the package labeled with my name. The lawyer hadn't intended for him to see it, but curiosity, once awakened, is difficult to quiet. My son asked to take it. The lawyer, bound by discretion but also moved by something he didn't name, handed it over. When I heard this, a strange mixture of dread and relief surged through me. Part of me wanted to shout that it wasn't ready, that he would read it out of anger, looking for flaws to confirm what he already believed. But another part, the quieter one, knew that if he was reading my words at all, it was more than I had expected after the birthday rejection. The nights that followed were restless. I imagined him flipping through the pages, pausing at stories of his childhood, at confessions about my temper, at the soft admissions of love I had been too stubborn to say aloud. Would he dismiss it as an excuse? Would he mock it as self-pity? Or would he finally see the man behind the father he had judged so harshly? Days passed with no response. Every time the phone rang, I felt my chest tighten, only to find it was a neighbor, a distant cousin, or some telemarketer. I stopped answering altogether, letting the unanswered calls pile up like unopened letters. Then came a small envelope in the mail, postmarked with his city. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with only one sentence written. I don't know what to do with this. No greeting, no closing, not even his name. But I recognized the handwriting immediately. I sat with that note for hours. At first, I felt frustration. It wasn't enough. I wanted explanations, apologies, anything more than that flat admission of uncertainty. But as the evening stretched on, I began to realize that the fact he had written at all meant something. Silence had been broken, if only by a crack. In the days that followed, I didn't push him for more. Instead, I kept writing, not to him directly but about him, about us. I poured out memories and reflections, not expecting him to read these new pages but needing to keep the dialogue alive. Even if it was one-sided. Weeks later, I received another note. This time it was longer, though still clipped. He wrote about his own childhood memories, but they were not the same ones I had written. Where I remembered joy, he remembered loneliness. Where I thought I had been present, he felt absence. The contrast was sharp, almost painful, like seeing two photographs of the same moment but from angles so different they might have been different days. His letter ended with a question I hadn't expected. Why didn't you tell me these things then? That question stayed with me like a stone in my pocket. I didn't know how to answer it simply, because the truth was that I hadn't known how to be vulnerable when he was young. My own father had left no map for tenderness, only a set of rules about discipline and silence. I had followed that model too closely, even when I thought I was breaking free. So I began drafting a response. Not defensive, not argumentative, but honest. I admitted that I hadn't known how to speak love plainly. I admitted that pride had sometimes turned into distance. And I admitted that his question was fair, that a child should never have to guess whether his father cares, that I didn't know if sending that letter would make things better or worse. But I knew holding it back would only repeat the old pattern of silence. So I mailed it. The waiting began again, heavy and uncertain. But this time I wasn't just waiting for him. I was waiting for myself, for the chance to prove that I could stay open, even if the response was rejection. When his reply finally came, it wasn't a letter. It was his voice. The phone rang one evening just as I was convincing myself I'd stop waiting. I picked it up without checking the caller ID, and there he was. His first words weren't a greeting. He said, "I read it again." My heart jolted at the sound, at the bluntness. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. He didn't sound angry, but neither did he sound forgiving. His tone was clipped, like each word had been weighed before being spoken. He told me he had finished the manuscript cover to cover, and though it hadn't answered every question, it had forced him to see me differently. Not better, not worse, just differently. That word, hanging there, felt heavier than praise or insult. That I asked if we could meet. There was a pause long enough for me to hear the hum of his city apartment through the receiver. Then he said, "I'll drive down this weekend. Don't make it into a big thing." And then the line went dead. That I spent the next 2 days walking circles in the house, touching objects I hadn't noticed in years, as if tidying memories instead of furniture. The chair where he once sat as a boy with his toy cars. The dent in the wall from an old argument when he was a teenager. Every detail seemed louder now that he was coming back. When he arrived, he didn't bring flowers or gifts. He just stood at the doorway, taller than I remembered, holding nothing but a folded jacket. For a moment I thought he might turn around before even stepping in. But he crossed the threshold and sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where birthdays, punishments, and announcements had once unfolded. The silence between us was jagged. I tried to break it by offering him coffee, and he nodded without speaking. As I set the cup in front of him, I realized my hands were shaking. He noticed too. I saw his eyes flick down, then away. Finally, he spoke. "When I read about the night you lost your temper, the way you wrote it, I realized you hated yourself more than you hated me." His words landed with a mixture of clarity and ache. I admitted it was true. I told him that so much of my anger back then was really shame turned outward. He nodded slowly, as if testing whether to trust that admission. Then he leaned forward. "But why didn't you ever just say it? Why did it have to wait until now? Until I found those pages by accident?" That was the question I had feared most, and yet hearing it aloud felt like a strange kind of mercy. I told him that I hadn't known how, that my father never taught me, that I thought silence was strength, that I believed providing was enough. And that by the time I realized how much I had left unsaid, the distance between us felt too wide to cross. That he didn't let me off easily. That silence shaped me. It's why I don't let people in. It's why I second-guess when someone says they care. He didn't raise his voice, but the force of his words cut through me more than any anger could. I wanted to argue, to defend myself by pointing to the times I had shown up, at his games, his graduations, the small gestures that I thought mattered. But I stopped myself. This wasn't about tallying deeds. It was about recognizing the gap between what I thought I gave and what he actually received. Instead, I said, "You're right. I left you to guess too much. And I'm sorry." The apology didn't dissolve the air between us, but it softened it. For the first time since he arrived, his shoulders lowered. He sipped the coffee, grimaced at the taste, and muttered, "Still too strong." It was such a small thing, almost a joke, but I felt tears rising. That ordinary complaint carried more forgiveness than any grand statement. We talked for hours. Not everything was resolved, not even close. But we spoke openly about things that had never been spoken before. He told me about moments I didn't even know I had missed. Nights he stayed awake waiting for me to come home. Mornings when he wanted to ask for help but kept quiet because he assumed I'd dismiss him. I admitted the ways I had failed, the choices I regretted, the walls I had built without realizing they were fences between us. And he listened, not always kindly, but fully. That was more than I had expected. As the evening stretched on, he stood to leave. At the door, he hesitated. Then he said, "I don't forgive you yet, but I'm not shutting the door either." It wasn't closure. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was something alive, something unfinished, and that felt more hopeful than any final answer. When he drove away, the house felt both emptier and lighter. I realized that the manuscript had done more than speak for me. It had forced us into a conversation neither of us could keep avoiding. And though I knew there would be more hard questions, maybe even more anger, I felt ready for them. Because for the first time, silence wasn't the only thing between us. After he left that night, I couldn't sleep. His words replayed in my head with the rhythm of a hammer. "I don't forgive you yet." That single sentence carried more weight than years of silence ever had. It was both a punishment and an opening, like a locked door with a key left dangling just out of reach. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the manuscript. For the first time, I wondered if my story had reached its limit. Maybe it wasn't my words he needed anymore. Maybe he needed his own. That thought unsettled me, because I realized how tightly I'd clung to being the one who explained, justified, and confessed. But what if the next step wasn't mine? 2 days later, an email arrived. It was from him. Not long, not emotional, just a document attached with the subject line. "Read this when you're ready." My hands shook as I clicked it open. What I found wasn't an essay or a letter. It was his beginning, his version of a manuscript. The first sentence knocked the wind out of me. "I grew up in a house where the loudest voice wasn't spoken." It was silence that I had to stop reading after that line, because tears blurred the page. He had taken what I thought was mine alone, the right to record, to confess, to own the story, and claimed it for himself. And I realized that was exactly what he needed. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was a man making sense of his own past, on his own terms. When I finally read it through, I saw myself through his eyes in ways that no mirror or memory had ever revealed. He wrote about moments I'd long forgotten. The way I left the TV on late into the night instead of talking. The mornings when I drove him to school and filled the silence with weather reports instead of asking about his life. None of it was exaggerated. None of it cruel. But each detail was like a stone laid in a wall I hadn't realized I built so high at the end of his draft. He wrote, "I don't know if this will ever be finished. But I needed to start. Because if you can write about who you were, maybe I can write about who I became in the shadow of that." I sat for hours at that table, the screen glowing in front of me, realizing something I should have known all along. My story was never complete without his. It was never just mine to tell. That weekend, I drove to his apartment. My car felt smaller than usual, as though the distance between us could barely fit inside its frame. When he opened the door, I didn't carry flowers or gifts either. Just my laptop, tucked under my arm. He looked surprised to see me. Maybe even cautious, but he stepped aside. We didn't hug. We didn't exchange pleasantries. I placed the laptop on his table and said, "If you're writing, then maybe we should write together." He stared at me, half skeptical, half curious. "You mean what? Like combine them?" "No," I said. "Not combine. Lay them side by side. Let them argue. Let them contradict each other if they have to. But let's put them in the same room." For the first time in years, I saw something soften in his face. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But curiosity. That was enough. The following hours felt like something fragile being built, word by word. We compared drafts, sometimes laughing at how differently we remembered the same moment, sometimes sitting in silence when the weight was too much. He told me about his fear that my version might swallow his. I promised him I wasn't here to edit or overshadow, only to witness. At one point he said, "If people ever read this, they'll know more about us than we probably want." I answered, "That's the risk of telling the truth. But maybe it's better than leaving the silence to speak for us." When I left that evening, I didn't feel resolved. But I felt something I hadn't in a long time, useful not as a father trying to fix the past, but as a partner in his process. Back home, I printed his draft and placed it beside mine. Seeing them together, pages overlapping, margins brushing, I realized the betrayal that began this story, the exclusion from his life, had forced me to finally face the truth. My voice alone was never enough. The silence had always needed two voices to break it. When I woke up the next morning, I kept thinking about those 2 stacks of paper sitting side by side on my desk. His draft and mine. They didn't look like rival accounts anymore. They looked like a conversation that had finally started after years of silence. But the question that pressed against me was whether that conversation should remain private, just between us, or if it needed to be carried further into the world. I knew how he felt about exposure. His words the night before still echoed. If people read this, they'll know more than we want them to. That wasn't an exaggeration. Between his pages and mine, there were truths that peeled back every safe layer we'd ever used to hide behind. But wasn't that the point? For years, secrecy had been the glue that held our distance in place. The only way to weaken it was to let light in. That week, I asked him to meet me again. Not at his apartment, but at a small cafe near the library. It was neutral ground, a place where neither of us had history, and where silence didn't feel like a punishment. When he walked in, he looked wary, but he didn't turn back. He ordered his coffee and slid into the seat across from me. "I've been thinking," I began carefully. "What if this isn't just for us? What if we let others see it?" His eyes narrowed. "Others? Not strangers yet. Maybe just family first. Your aunt, your cousin. People who lived around us but never knew the full story. People who only saw the surface." He leaned back, arms crossed. "You really want to make this some kind of performance?" "No," I said quickly. "Not a performance. A truth-telling. Together." For a long moment he didn't answer. He stared at his cup like it might provide an escape. Finally he said, "I don't know if I'm ready to have people looking at me through the lens of what you did, or didn't do. I don't want pity. I don't want judgment." I nodded. "I don't want that either. But what if it isn't about what they think of you or me? What if it's about showing them what silence does to people? Maybe someone else in the family is carrying the same weight." He didn't respond, but I saw the flicker in his expression, the recognition that maybe the story wasn't just ours. The following weekend we sat down with his cousin, Lisa. She was always the one who noticed more than she admitted, the one who asked polite questions but never pressed too hard. We gave her both sets of pages, asking her to read them side by side. She didn't speak while she read. She just kept turning the pages, sometimes pausing, sometimes glancing at one of us. When she finally finished, she placed the papers on the table and said quietly, "This explains so much. I always wondered why there was a shadow between you two, even when you were in the same room." Her words broke something open. My son didn't argue. He didn't retreat. He just asked her, "Did it change how you see me?" Lisa shook her head. "No. It makes me understand you better. Both of you." That night, for the first time, my son called me without me prompting. His voice on the phone was calmer than I expected. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe if we keep this hidden, nothing really changes. But if we let it out, even a little, maybe we stop being defined by what we didn't say." It was the closest thing to agreement we'd had in years. Over the next month, we refined the drafts, not by editing content but by deciding the order. Sometimes his version came first, sometimes mine. We didn't erase contradictions. We let them stand. Where I remembered anger, he remembered emptiness. Where he remembered isolation, I remembered distraction. We allowed the story to be fractured, because fracture was the truth. When the day finally came to share with a wider circle, my nerves nearly unraveled me. We gathered a few relatives in Lisa's living room, each of them holding printed copies. I braced for judgment, but what I felt instead was an unexpected kind of stillness as they read. It wasn't boredom. It was the weight of recognition. When they finished, no one launched into criticism. Instead, my brother spoke first. "I had no idea. I thought you two were just distant by choice." My son replied softly, "It wasn't a choice. Not for me." Hearing him speak like that, not as an accusation but as a statement of fact, hit harder than anything he'd written. And for the first time, I didn't defend myself. I let his truth stand beside mine, equal and unchallenged. Walking out of that gathering, I realized something important. The resolution I had secretly hoped for, that we would somehow erase the past and start over, wasn't going to happen. What we had instead was a shared process, a layered narrative that belonged to both of us. It wasn't tidy, but it was real. Later that evening, he sent me a short text. Just 5 words. Thanks for not silencing me. That single line did more than any apology could. It told me that, at least for now, the wall between us had cracks wide enough for light to pass through. After we shared those pages with the family, I thought that would be the end of it. A release, nothing more. But the strange thing about letting a truth out is that it doesn't shrink back into silence. It grows. A few weeks later, my son asked me, almost casually, "What if we take this further? What if other people, outside the family, could see it too?" I stared at him, unsure if I'd heard correctly. This was the same boy who once refused to let me into his apartment, who'd told me in no uncertain terms that my presence was unwelcome. And now he was the one suggesting exposure, inviting the world into our private cracks. It left me unsettled, but also oddly hopeful that I asked him, "Are you sure? That's a big step." He shrugged. "I've been thinking about it. If people only see the surface, they assume everything's fine. Or worse, they assume I'm fine. And I'm not. I wasn't. Maybe if they read it, they'd stop pretending families like ours don't exist." That conversation replayed in my head for days. I kept circling back to the irony. He, who once rejected my presence, now wanted to use our shared presence on the page to reach others. It felt like a reversal, a fragile turning point I didn't want to mishandle. We met at the library again to talk it through. This time, we brought both drafts in a single folder. He spread the pages across the table like evidence, then looked at me. "The question is how? Do we write it as a book? Do we publish it online? Or do we just leave copies somewhere? Let them find their own way?" I was hesitant. Publishing meant permanence. Once out in the world, there would be no pulling it back, no undoing. People would read, interpret, criticize. "If we do this," I said carefully, "we have to be ready for the consequences. People won't always understand. They might pick sides. They might even blame one of us more than the other." He nodded. "I've thought about that. But isn't that better than silence?" Silence already picked sides. It picked distance. That hit me harder than I expected. I realized he wasn't just thinking about our family anymore. He was thinking bigger, about all the kids who grew up feeling like outsiders in their own homes, and about the parents who were too blind or stubborn to see it. Over the next month, we shaped the drafts into a single document. Not one seamless story, because our memories didn't fit neatly together, but an interwoven one, alternating voices, showing the fractures and contradictions side by side. We called it The Room Between Us. He came up with the title, and I agreed instantly. It captured exactly what had haunted us all those years. A space we both occupied, but never at the same time. The first time we saw it printed and bound, just a rough copy from a print shop, we sat in silence, staring at the cover. Neither of us reached for it right away. Finally, he opened it, skimmed a few pages, and said softly, "It looks real now." When we decided to send it out to a small online journal, my heart nearly failed me. I imagined rejection, ridicule, or worse, indifference. But the editor responded within a week. She said she'd never read something that balanced accusation and confession in such a raw way. She wanted to publish excerpts. The night we got that email, my son and I sat together at his kitchen table. No shouting, no accusations. Just 2 people staring at a laptop screen, knowing something irreversible had begun. He broke the silence first. "Do you think this will change anything between us?" I didn't answer right away. Change was such a fragile word. Instead, I said, "Maybe it won't erase the past, but it might give us a way forward." And that's more than we had. When the excerpts were published, responses came in quickly. Some readers shared their own stories of estrangement, of birthdays with empty chairs, of years lost to pride and misunderstanding. Others criticized, saying parents like me should have tried harder, or children like him should have forgiven sooner. But through it all, one truth held steady. We weren't alone anymore. For the first time in decades, I felt like our story wasn't just ours. It belonged to a wider circle of people who carried similar scars. And in that strange way, the very rejection that once broke me, his message saying I wasn't invited, had led us here, to this place where we weren't hiding anymore. After the journal published our excerpts, something shifted in the air between us. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't clean, but it was real. The years of silence and distance didn't vanish overnight. They lingered in small ways, in pauses between sentences, in the way he sometimes flinched at a phrase that sounded too much like the father he remembered, not the one sitting in front of him. But there was movement where before there had been only walls. One evening, he invited me to a small community event. They were hosting a reading, and he thought we might share a portion of the room between us. The idea terrified me. Standing in front of strangers, airing the darkest parts of our lives. It felt too raw, too exposed. But he insisted. We wrote this for more than ourselves. If we don't speak it, we're just hiding again. That night, we stood at the back of the room as other people read poems, essays, and stories. Some were about loss, others about survival, and a few were about families that sounded too familiar. When it was our turn, my son stepped up first. His voice was steady at first, then cracked slightly as he reached the part about birthdays spent alone. I followed with my section, about the empty hallway outside his apartment door, where I once stood with a bag of groceries, not knowing if I should knock. When we finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then someone clapped, and the sound grew until the whole space filled with it. Not applause for performance, but recognition. Afterward, people approached us. Some said thank you. Others shared quick flashes of their own fractured families. One woman whispered, "You said the thing I've never been able to admit." Driving home, my son looked out the window and said, almost to himself, "Maybe this is what repair looks like. Not forgetting, not pretending, but putting it out there and letting others carry some of it too." The following months were different from anything I'd expected. We still argued, though less often. Sometimes old resentments surfaced in sudden ways, triggered by nothing more than a tone of voice. But instead of storming out, he stayed. Instead of shutting down, I listened. Small as it sounds, it felt like progress. One Sunday, he came by unannounced. He stood awkwardly at the door, holding a bag of groceries. "I thought maybe we could cook tonight," he said. For a second, I just stared. It was the mirror image of the day I'd stood outside his door years ago. Rejected. Only now, he was offering what I once tried to give. I stepped aside and let him in. We chopped vegetables, burned the onions, argued over how much salt to use. It wasn't graceful, but it was ours. At the table, he asked me something I never expected. "If you could go back, what would you change?" The question stopped me. There were 100 answers, but none that could erase what had already been done. "I think I would have listened sooner," I said finally. Listened without needing to defend myself. I thought being a father meant always knowing. But I didn't know. And I should have admitted that. He didn't respond right away. He just nodded, as if weighing my words. Then he said, "I think I would have let you in, even if it hurt. Maybe we both thought shutting the door was safer." That was the closest we'd come to forgiveness. Not a clean slate, not an erasure, but a recognition that both of us had chosen distance, and both of us were now choosing something else. The book slowly gained more readers. A small publisher reached out, asking if we'd consider expanding it into a full-length memoir. We hesitated, unsure if we wanted to relive everything again. But in the end, we agreed. Not because we needed more exposure, but because we realized the story wasn't just about us. It was about everyone who had sat in that silence, everyone who had wondered if the door would ever open again. Working on the expanded version became a kind of ritual. We'd meet once a week, trade chapters, argue over memory, laugh at contradictions, and sometimes fall into silence when the weight became too much. Those silences were different now. Not the emptiness of avoidance, but the pause of two people who had decided to stay in the room together. One evening, after a long editing session, my son closed his notebook and said, "You know, I don't think I hate birthdays anymore. Maybe I'll even have a real one next year." I smiled, though I didn't press him. I knew better than to demand promises. Still, I thought about it later that night. The idea of sitting in a room with him, celebrating, not as the father I used to pretend to be, but as the man I was learning to become, that felt like something worth holding on to. If you'd asked me years ago whether reconciliation was possible, I would have said no. The damage felt final. But now I see it differently. Reconciliation isn't a grand gesture or a sudden return. It's 1,000 small choices made in moments when it would be easier to retreat. It's sitting at a table with onions burning in the pan and deciding not to walk away. Maybe that's how it will be for us. No perfect ending, no neat ribbon tied around the past. Just the ongoing decision to show up, even when it's messy, even when it hurts. And as I think about the man who once turned me away with a message that said I wasn't invited, I realize something. The invitation I wanted then will never come. But the one he offered now, the chance to stand beside him, not as the father who failed, but as the father who stayed, that's the one that matters. There's a certain peace that comes after the storm, when the shouting dies down and you're left with nothing but your own choices staring back at you. For me, it wasn't about winning against my son, or proving a point to anyone else. It was about reclaiming my dignity, brick by brick, after years of letting others dictate the rhythm of my home. Families can betray you in the quietest of ways, and sometimes the only way forward is to stop clinging to what's broken. I walked away with my head high, not because I had all the answers, but because I finally chose myself. But life has a way of testing that resolve again, often in unexpected places. If you've ever wondered what happens when standing your ground with family comes at the cost of the roof over your head, and how letting go of one home can open the door to a freedom you never imagined, you'll want to stay with me for what came next. It's a story that still makes me pause when I think of the porch I left behind.